So I just want to give a little bit of an overview before we dive into Anthony's experience with the Michigan Redistricting Commission by just talking about different processes and how they set up their commissions in other states, as we in Pennsylvania hope to maybe get our own commission for the next round of redistricting. So just a quick overview of what I'll be focusing on just briefly is we're going to talk about independence. We tend to just lump in independent redistricting commissions as a phrase. All redistricting commissions are not inherently independent or created equal, so we're going to dive into why how we set up commissions is really important for the outcomes. We're going to talk about the process, specifically whether there are fail-safes available for if commissioners don't agree, which we'll see happens a lot. And then finally, we'll briefly discuss outcomes before we look at the gold standard commission, which is Michigan. Next slide, please. Awesome. So I just want to go over how other states have set up their commissions. So Ohio, first of all, technically the legislature is able to draw a map first. So in Ohio, the legislature has the chance to draw their congressional maps. If they don't get 60% of the legislature, including 50% of each party, to agree on a map, it then gets punted to the independent commission. That independent commission is made up of 7 individuals, 3 of which are elected officials themselves, the governor, the auditor, and the secretary of state. And then each majority and minority leader in both chambers of the Ohio state legislature gets to appoint someone to that commission. So there's very little independence. It's a very political commission. Virginia, on the other hand, has 16 people on its commission, 8 citizens who are appointed by former judges, and then 8 appointees of legislators appointed once again by the majority and minority leaders of the legislature. So once again, it's about split half and half, but it's still primarily a partisan commission. And finally, Michigan just randomly selects citizens for Republicans, 4 Democrats, and then 5 nonpartisan individuals. And as Anthony will describe, they are randomly selected. So why this is so important, as we'll see on the next slide, who you put on your commission plays a huge role in determining how that process will play out. So in Ohio, they have a lot of rules. So if the commission in the legislature does not approve maps in a bipartisan manner, they're only valid for 4 years. So just to give you a bit of the Ohio story, bear with me, it's pretty complicated. So they started off with the legislature drawing a map. It was not bipartisan, so it was booted to the commission. The commission drew a map that the courts found to be unconstitutional. So then the state legislature once again had a chance of drawing their congressional maps. Once again, the state legislature did not draw maps that received bipartisan support. When they draw the maps in the second round, the Ohio Commission, the constitutional amendment that they passed, requires them to provide detailed explanations on how their maps fit into criteria such as compactness, proportionality, contiguity, and then preserving units of government. So they're required to provide a written account of why they drew their map the way they did. Once again, the Ohio legislature failed to draw a map that the courts found to be constitutional, and then they just stopped drawing. So they currently used maps that were deemed unconstitutional for their general election, and they will have to draw them again before the next redistricting cycle. So Ohio is an example very clearly of how commissions can fail. Virginia, on the other hand, is a bit of a mixed bag. So the Virginia Commission got together 16 individuals, 8 citizens, 8 legislators, and they appointed special masters to draw draft maps. The way they did it is they had a Republican master and then a Democrat master draw their maps. So they were going to vote on which map to use as a draft map. So of course the commission, as you might expect, met to agree on which map to use as their starting point. So they have one map that's labeled Republican and one map that's labeled Democratic, and they voted 8-8 on which map to use, shocker. They could not agree. Someone actually just left the meeting, never to join the commission again, because they couldn't get anywhere, because they were explicitly drawing maps in a partisan manner and thinking that somebody was gonna cross the aisle to pick that other party's map. So Virginia, for both their congressional maps and their state legislative maps, they could not agree on anything, which meant the process went to the Supreme Court to draw those maps. So at least in Virginia, they did have a backup for if commissions could not agree on what to draw. So the Virginia Supreme Court put together a list of names on special masters to draw the maps. They gave the legislative leaders power to eliminate one or two names. Ultimately, it came down to two special masters, one from each party. These people would be tasked with drawing the map. So they drew the map, gave the public time to comment, and as we'll talk about in the outcome, it is a pretty fair map, but unfortunately, because there was no commission, we didn't have as transparent as a process as you might want to have when it's kind of drawn by special masters appointed by the court. Michigan, on the other hand, like I said, the gold standard, as Anthony will talk about, they had transparency during the mapping process. Their commission is set up so that nonpartisan individuals have a plurality on the commission. They agreed on a schedule of mapping before they started. They held public hearings across the state, and ultimately they proposed maps without partisan labels. So they were all voting on maps named after trees, as Anthony will talk about, rather than labeled Democrat or Republican. And then to agree on maps, they used ranked choice voting. So on the next slide, I'll just go over the outcomes. So Ohio, thumbs down. So ultimately, they are voting on unconstitutional maps that will only be valid for 4 years or 2 general election cycles. And they didn't get anywhere, and they eventually just stopped drawing maps and stopped following the law, essentially. Virginia, they didn't have agreement by commissioners, but at least they had a backup plan for what to do if they didn't agree. That power was sent to the courts, and they came up with a pretty fair map. The election results were 52-48 for congressional seats, and they have a 6-5 split. So it's a pretty proportional map. And then in Michigan, they had agreement on all maps, and ultimately they had a very proportional result and a very transparent process. And I just wanted to give this as kind of a preface to Anthony's presentation to describe how it's really important in Pennsylvania, before we just say we want an independent commission, we really have to think about how we want that commission to be structured, what are the backups when that commission doesn't agree, what do we want to make sure they are set up to do. We don't want to set them up to fail like so many other states unfortunately have. So we want to put a lot of thought into that heading into our advocacy before our next round of redistricting. So my understanding of the legal framework is that the one side is arguing that the commission is not the state legislature, so they don't have to, they have total power in drawing the maps, whereas the legislature has to follow more strict rules. That was probably very not legal language, but that's my general understanding. But the Supreme Court chose not to hold them in contempt of the law when they stopped drawing maps. So that's still very much an ongoing, there are lots of lawsuits out there, but we're still kind of watching that saga unfold.
So perhaps any comment on those or comparisons on those?
Yeah, I can briefly just say I picked these because they're most similar to Pennsylvania as a state. Virginia is a Commonwealth. They're both mid-Atlantic states, states in the Midwest, Rust Belt states, and obviously they have a good variety of outcomes. I would say Colorado, Arizona, California, New York, they all have relatively successful mapping commissions, but I think Michigan was the one that had the most favorable in terms of the public outcome. I know there were some controversial decisions in both Arizona and Colorado with their independent commissions, particularly in terms of communities of interest. And something else I would note that Anthony talked about this morning was that Michigan has criteria and they're ranked in level of importance, which is something I think other commissions don't have. That is also really key, so that there's actually you can argue that any map is a good map, and there's never going to be a perfect map. So I think other commissions kind of falter to Michigan in that they don't have that specific criteria to use in a certain order of what they should be prioritizing, if that somewhat answers your question. Any other questions before we move on to Anthony? Okay, thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you, Michael, for that, for teeing me up there and comparing Michigan to some of the other processes in the country. Man, Ohio, right? Who can believe it? It's just another reason why Michigan's better. Go blue, am I right? Ohio's probably going to make the college football playoff now, and we'll just beat them again. So that'll be great. All right, y'all, I'm Anthony Eade. I'm going to be presenting today on Michigan's Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission. I really feel that this is a model that can potentially be used nationwide for states that are looking to get new independent redistricting commissions. So I'm kind of coming at this presentation as I would do a science research presentation, and in those we always have disclosures at the beginning. So let's start. These opinions are my own. They might not represent the whole commission, No outside funds were used to create this. There's going to be some legal jargon, but I'm not a lawyer, so take those with a grain of salt. And I have plenty of sources on here. We have our own website. We have some friends at U of M and MSU, Voters Not Politicians, Princeton Gerrymandering Project. Most of y'all should recognize these. Let's move forward. So history, went over this a little earlier. In 2018, Michigan voters passed Proposal 2018-2 that created the Michigan Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission, comprised of 13 randomly selected Michigan voters from the application pool, and we're responsible for drawing our congressional, state house, and state senate maps. I was quite surprised to learn earlier today that y'all have 203 house seats. Wow. Before doing this, I actually did not know Michigan had 110. And learning that, I was pretty surprised. But to do almost double that at 203, I couldn't imagine. That is a lot of representation there. We also have 38 House seats and 13 U.S. congressional seats. We had 14, but according to this last census cycle, we've gone down to 13. One of our core values is transparency. Transparency is constitutionally guaranteed. We have to follow the Open Meetings Act, and all of our meetings were live, from the first random drawing process where we were selected to interviewing our staff. I always feel bad for our staff because who would want to do an interview on YouTube in front of the whole state watching? But they did it, and the public commented on their applications and commented on their interviews, and the public had a say in who we hired. And finally, in the map drawing. All of our map drawing happened live. People could comment in real time while we were drawing maps. People could submit maps to us. So transparency was really one of the core values of this commission. And finally, even all of our mapping data was available to the public. So any line, even a single change that was drawn to any single district would be uploaded to our public portal for the public to see and do their own analyses on, or submit comment to us if they wanted to. So, as Michael said, structure is very, very important when it comes to these. And I think the biggest strength of our commission was the structure. Having the 3 pools of applicants, 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, and 5 independents, created a situation where we had to come to compromise in order to get anything passed. I happen to think that's a good thing. Michigan is a purple state. There are people on both sides of the aisle, lots of moderates on both sides, lots of independents. And having to come up with that compromise so one side couldn't team up with each other or railroad the other side, I think was a big reason why we were successful in these maps. Next slide, please. Also, another thing is we have open primaries in Michigan, which I know is something that y'all don't have here, but because we have open primaries, those pools of applicants were self-identifying. Now finally, here's a little bit of a grand overview of the phases that we went through with the process. As you can see, there were quite a few phases. The first 3 are above that blue line because that's what the state did. And everything below that blue line is what we did as an independent commission. So you start by the application process. There was an application you had to fill out, but pretty much the only requirements were you had to be a registered voter and you couldn't have any family members that were, direct family members that were a part of the legislature or were lobbyists or stuff like that. They did the random drawing and then they convened the commission. After we convened, we hired staff. We then went on our first round of public hearings. The census data was delayed, so we got our census data a little later this cycle. We then drew our initial maps. We then took those initial maps on a second round of public hearings to hear what folks thought of them. Then we improved the maps with that public input. Finally, we selected proposed maps, and those proposed maps went into a 45-day public comment window. After those 45 days were up, we voted to adopt maps. That's where we're at now. The maps are adopted into law. They were used for this last election. And now we're fighting a few lawsuits and considering how to disband. Everything in this process was included in the Michigan Constitution, so it's going to have to be used in the future. It wasn't just like a policy thing that we did. So I'll do our public hearings, and then I have a slide on the random selection process. So according to the Michigan Constitution, before drawing any maps, we had to go on at least 10 public hearings. Because the census data was delayed, we had a little bit more time on our hands before we could put pen to paper and start drawing. We were able to use that time to go to 15 different cities around our state. You can see on this map here, we went places all the way from Detroit, all the way up here to the Upper Peninsula and Marquette. We really tried to visit every part of our state. And on top of these public hearings, we also went to smaller parts of towns, in libraries and coffee shops to let people know what we were doing, make them aware of the new redistricting process, and make sure that their voices could be heard. After that initial drawing, we again went to 5 of these cities again in order to hear what they thought. We also went on a university tour at the various 15 public universities around our state to hear what students thought of our maps and try to get input from a variety of age groups. In total, there were about 30,000 public comments when you combine the written public comment, the in-person testimony, and all the emails we got. And I'm proud to say that I read and listened to every single one of them. So I spoke earlier today about our redistricting criteria. I have them listed out here, and again, these are according to the Constitution. If another state wants to do independent redistricting, I think these criteria are key because it makes it so that the commission has criteria that they need to follow. They can't just do whatever they want. To be legal maps, you got to prove that you followed this. And what's interesting is that these are ranked. So the top criteria overrule the lesser criteria. Something that's interesting about Michigan compared to other states are things like county lines, city lines, township lines are quite a bit lower on the list of criteria than things like communities of interest and partisan fairness. There are a lot of opinions about that. I didn't choose that, but the Michigan voters chose that when they adopted the constitutional criteria. And it did create a benefit in that we were able to get advocacy from specific communities that might not always live in a compact area and make districts where their voices could be heard as well. And I have some examples of that later. What even is a community of interest, right? It's this vague term, and it is vague in some ways. It's kind of purposely vague because you don't want it to be exclusive, but there are also things it doesn't include. So here's the language in the Constitution. Historical and economic interest would be one thing. Cultural, geographical interest could be another. But what's important is what it's not. A community of interest is not a political party. It is not a political ideology or supporting incumbent or current potential candidates. How did we collect these public comments? We had multiple types of submission tools. If you go to michiganmapping.org, we have a tool to submit a community of interest, to submit a public comment map. That used District R toolset. And after we proposed maps, we posted them online via a state website, and people could make little pin drops in specific locations on those maps to tell us what they thought. These were all then compiled, right? It's like 30,000 comments. How do you sort through all that? Well, we had some good people to help. These heat maps were created by the MGG lab by Dr. Moon Duchin, and they were able to compile a bunch of the individual public comments and turn them into these heat maps that the commission was then able to use to see where the most common areas of interest were. And these maps were a big deal. They were one of the main things I looked at when drawing the congressional map that ended up being passed. All in all, it created 42 different of these clusters around the state. You see that one in the center, that's the Lansing area. You see the one on the bottom left, that is like the St. Clair Shores area northeast of Detroit. And these public comments, they really did end up in the final map. On the left here, I wish you could see it better, but we have a testimony from an individual from West Bloomfield advocating for West Bloomfield to be included in their surrounding counties because previously it had, for political reasons, been put with more northern counties that did not have a community of interest with West Bloomfield. On the right is the district that ended up in the final map, District 20, which recombined West Bloomfield with its fellow neighbors. Next slide. Here's a public comment about Dearborn Heights, an Arab American community of interest. And you can see on the left, that is the map the individual submitted. Right here. You can see the final map, the district number 15, that ended up being added, is pretty darn close to that comment. Next slide. This is one of those non-compact communities of interest I talked about, and this is actually one of my favorite ones in the whole map. We had quite a large outcry from lakeshore communities of interest that rely on the lakes, rely on tourism, and rely on agriculture in order to support their way of life. On the left, you can see the community of interest that individual submitted, and on the right, you can see the final district that ended up in the map. In the congressional map as well, congressional maps are much bigger districts. Here's an example of a community of interest of the border counties between Michigan and Ohio and Michigan and Indiana. We had folks say that these counties shared numerous interstate interests with their neighboring states, people crossing state lines to do business, to go shopping, even to pray. And you can see on the left, that community of interest submission. There wasn't quite enough population in there, but we were able to add a little bit more to it and created District 5 as a border community of interest in the congressional map. As well as community of interest, we really wanted to take a data-based, evidence-based driven approach. As well, on top of doing a racial voting block analysis, we also undertook the first ever Arab American and Bengali voting pattern study. I believe it's the first one of its kind conducted in the country. On the left here, you can see, it's especially important because the census doesn't have all different types of immigrant groups on it. For example, there's no checkbox on the census for Middle Eastern or North African individuals. That often silences populations because they essentially go invisible. They either have to check other or white, and most people in those communities don't identify as either of those races. So on the left, you can see a small ethnic Chaldean population. We were able to determine where those folks were. And on the right, District 57, you can see that the district that was created reflected their community of interest. Big question here. Can counties be communities of interest? This is a question that our commission wrestled with for quite a while because we had folks coming in saying, my community of interest is my county. Well, that creates a problem for us because some of the more sparsely populated counties, if we were to make them their own district, it would dilute the proportionality of the map overall. What we were actually ended up being advised was that county lines were specifically mentioned in the constitutional criteria to be a lower priority than communities of interest. And because they were specifically put as county lines, city lines, and township lines, as being lower, we decided that they were not communities of interest and had county splits be a lower priority than the types of communities of interest I was just speaking about on previous slides. Okay, so those are COIs. Finally, the census data came in. What are the major takeaways from the census in this cycle? Well, Detroit lost population to the suburbs. We also, even though Michigan overall gained slight population, we lost a congressional seat, so it went from 14 to 13. And then the suburbs of Detroit, Oakland County, Wayne County, and western Michigan, the Grand Rapids and Kent County areas were the fastest growing parts of the state. After getting that census data, we were able to start drawing maps. We had two concurrent processes to draw maps. The first was the live collaborative process where commissioners one by one would in real time take turns with our GIS software to draw districts. I could draw a district, then my fellow commissioner after me could edit that district, then the next one could edit that district. And if there were ever two districts that were in opposition to each other, we would just create a new map and have both choices out there for the public to hear. Through this process, we quite literally made hundreds of different maps that we sorted through. And then while that process was happening, individual commissioners could also submit their own completed maps for the commission to then see and take up. Anyways, so this was our initial first draft of maps. We ended up having 20 drafts that were brought on our second round of public comments. So we had all of these maps printed out for the public to see, and we took them to 5 different cities to hear what people thought of them. So funny thing, we named our maps after trees, right? We did this for a few reasons. One, bias is a specific interest of mine, being, in the medical field. We talk about bias all the time, and we, in this process, we had things like implicit bias training with the commissioners, and a whole bunch of other types of bias were examined. And we didn't want to bias, there we go, success. There we go, thank you. We didn't want to bias any map from each other by naming it something. So, being from Michigan, it was either going to be trees or cars. And we decided on trees, My vote would have been for cars personally. We could have a Mustang map, we could have a Corvette map, that'd be good, Stingray. But here are the choices that we took to our first round of public comments. You can see there were about 8 or 9 congressional plans. There was 6 state house plans and 6 state senate plans. Next slide. Thank you. We took these proposed maps on that second round of public comment I was talking about. After that second round of public comment was complete, we then took the advice we got from folks during the public comment period, and we used it to improve our maps and make sure the maps were as compliant with law as possible. At this point, we then submitted final proposed maps. Now, this is an important stopgap here, because at this point in the process, no new changes could be made, because if they were, it would restart the 45-day public comment window. And we didn't have time to do that because of the census delay and because of the deadlines that are in the Michigan Constitution to pass a map. So this was a real important deadline that we had in order to create enough time for folks to have 45 days to comment and enough time for us to take those comments and actually vote to adopt a plan. So here are the final maps that were submitted to that 45-day public comment window. In green are the collaborative maps. You see we have Chestnut. Chestnut was previously an individual commissioner's plan, but because of the public comments during that period where we were improving them, it became a collaborative map where the whole commission took the work of the individual commissioner and edited it in real time so that it can meet the needs of the whole commission. And we had 3 collaborative maps in each category, and then we also had the individual commissioner maps after that. Now, I think it was, it wasn't a need, but it was certainly a want for us to adopt collaborative maps. Not only because they were the most transparent and the most in public, but also because even if an individual commissioner disagreed with certain parts of the map, all of the commissioners had a hand in making it. So even if you didn't like some parts, there were certainly some parts that each commissioner did like. Voting process. So at this point, the final 45-day public comment window ended, and we went through our voting process. We did have ranked choice voting, but that was actually our second method. The first method in the Michigan Constitution is getting a majority of votes while also having 2 commissioners in each pool of candidates accept a map. So in order to pass a map, we need 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, 2 independents, plus 1 more to get majority. That's the best and the first option. If that option did not work, which it did, luckily, and I think it did work because of the collaborative process that we had, but if it didn't, we would then move on to the ranked choice voting process, where commissioners would rank their top choices. But even in that process, you had to have 2 votes in the top half of your rank be from 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and 2 independents. And then if that also didn't work, there was a third option, and we called this the nuclear option, where every commissioner would pick 1 map to put into a pool, and the Secretary of State would randomly select it. Luckily, we did not have to do that. The method 1 prevailed, and we were able to pass maps, not unanimously, but with a majority of commissioners, and that had commissioners from each pool vote for it. Here are the final maps that were adopted, and these are results from this previous 2022 election. We're finally going to start talking about outcomes. On the left, you have the Chestnut congressional map. In the middle, you have the Hickory House map, and on the right, you have the Linden State Senate map. Oh, misspell. I wasn't an English major. Spelling's always been a weak point of mine. Next slide, please. Partisan fairness metrics. Like I said, we wanted to take a data-based, evidence-backed approach to this process. And in order to achieve this, we took a 10-year election history, the previous 10 years of elections, and compiled them into a composite score in order to figure out our partisan fairness measures. If we look at the top on the congressional map, you can see that the composite score on efficiency gap, and keep in mind, some people disagree with what measures to use, so we used 4 different measures, and all of them were much closer to being fair than what the previous maps drawn by the legislature were. In all the maps, 3 of the 4 measures still had a slight Republican lean, but they were close enough to 0 that the commission felt comfortable with it. And more importantly, the data showed that in years where Democrats got the most votes, they would likely get the most seats, and likewise, in years where Republicans got the votes, they would also get the most seats. I have a comparison here between 3 previous elections, 2016, where the Republican candidate, Donald Trump, won by a slim margin. Then you have 2018 midterm election where the Democrats, it was a wave that year. They won by a quite significant margin. And then you have the 2020 presidential election where the Democratic candidate, Joe Biden, won, but by a much smaller majority than what had been shown in the 2018 election. And if you go through all this data, basically what you see is that the maps are fair. We went from an efficiency gap of plus 12% Republican in the congressional map to 0.6%. And I believe that's the lowest number according to 538 of any map in the country. The data also stays consistent with the state legislature maps. You can see in red there, that bottom number is what it was previously, and on top in bold is the composite number for each data point used. Next slide. Here's what the Princeton Gerrymandering Project said about our maps. They rated them pretty good overall at A's and B's. No partisan advantage or a very slight partisan advantage. Now, their data points are a little different than ours. We use 10 years of election history. Princeton Gerrymandering Project weighs more recent elections at a greater number than elections further away, while we weighed all 10 years of elections equally, so that could account for that number difference. But overall, pretty good marks from third parties overall. And outcomes, this was before the election, quite a lot of good news. Folks said that the maps essentially leveled the playing field and made it so that there's fairness, there's proportionality, and that was the goal. Here's a few more headlines. Probably my favorite one is that New York Times article, ungerrymandered, Michigan maps independently drawn, set up a fair fight. It wasn't a goal of ours per se to make competitive districts, because that wasn't one of the 7 ranked criteria, but it turned out that by following the other criteria, these districts were significantly more competitive than what had happened in the past. And that created a situation in this past election where quite a lot of incumbents were defeated. You can see that headline on the bottom, 9 Michigan legislatures, 9 Michigan lawmakers tossed out by voters. Next slide. Here's a comparison. This is from 538. You can see on top the new house map versus on bottom the old house map. And you can see the lighter shades of colors on top representing a more equitable and more proportional and more competitive races. And this is probably my favorite slide in this whole thing. This shows that the proportionality of our maps matched up almost exactly with what the vote share was. So for the congressional map, Democrats got 51% of the votes. They got 7 seats. In the state house, they got just over 50% of the vote, and they got just over 50% of the seats at 56 to 54. And in the state senate, they got almost 51%, and they got 20 seats to 18. So, a lot of headlines I've seen over the past few weeks say, oh, well, you guys just did a Democratic gerrymander. You guys put the thumbs on the scales for Democrats. And that really couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, like I said earlier, 3 of the 4 measures for partisan fairness still actually favor Republicans. But it just so happens in this election, for various reasons, a lot more people voted for Democrats. But in the future, there's certainly a scenario where people vote for Republicans, and if they do, then they will also end up with the majority of seats. This is another table that kind of shows the same thing. The closer these lines are together, the closer the proportionality is. So you can see, especially like here in 2014, these lines are, further apart. And that means one party got a disproportionate amount of votes compared to the amount of seats and power they ended up being able to hold. And as you can see, we go to 2022, the first election under the new maps, the lines are overlapping. Okay, it's not all good, right? We did have some criticisms. We do have a few lawsuits in play right now about potential VRA issues. So, that is still yet to be adjudicated. I think a lot of this comes from folks not, and again, I'm not a lawyer, but this is what our lawyers have told us. A candidate of choice doesn't necessarily need to be the same race as the minority community that is electing them. For example, Detroit is about a 75% black city, but we've elected a white mayor the past 3 election cycles, and there's no district in that race, so no one can say it's due to the district. Next slide. Likewise, again, data. That was the thing we wanted to hit. We conducted the racial bloc voting analysis. It showed that in the past, districts were heavily packed with black voters in order to dilute their representation and give them the least amount of district power possible. That in hand also made the maps less proportional because in Michigan, black voters vote overwhelmingly Democratic. Because of this history, we were advised to reduce that number of massively packed districts to a much lesser number to still give folks the ability to elect their candidates of choice, but increase the overall number of opportunity districts where they would be able to have their voice heard. And a good example of this is in Detroit. In the 2020 cycle, where we had 14 congressional districts, there were 2 minorities, 1 black rep, Brenda Lawrence, and both of those reps, Brenda Lawrence and Rashida Tlaib, were the black candidate of choice. Fast forward to the 2022 election, where we lost a congressional map, so 1 less potential seat, only 13 instead of 14, the minority representation actually went up. You have Rashida Tlaib, Shri Tanadar, and John James. The interesting thing is, the black candidate, John James, is most likely not the black candidate of choice, which, it throws people for a loop because most people think, oh, black people are going to automatically vote for the black candidate, but that's not the case. It was actually his opponent that was the black candidate of choice, but John James got more votes. Likewise, Rashida Tlaib and Shri Tanadar got a plurality of black votes in their primaries. So while we haven't done a racial voting block analysis on these maps quite yet, I think when we do, it's likely to show that these candidates were in fact the black candidate of choice, and the opportunity for the community to elect is still there. But that's yet to be seen. We'll see how these lawsuits play out. We did have one in the state Supreme Court that ruled in our favor, and we have a few more in federal court to work out. So challenges. COVID-19 was a big issue. We had to start our meetings remotely, and that kind of created a lack of camaraderie between the commissioners. Later on in the process, we were able to meet in person, and that was a lot better for teamwork, a lot better for just working together and getting that compromise we were talking about earlier. There was the delay in the census data that created less time to draw maps, and we had to actually blow past the constitutional deadline and get a special exception by the court to get an extension because the voting, the census data wasn't there, so we couldn't draw. Primary election data, we need more of it. There weren't that many contested primary elections in Michigan in the past. I think in the next 10 years, due to these maps, there will be, and that'll help make future commissions exhibit even better decision-making processes than we did. There was also safety. So we had a few safety issues during this process. There was a lot of vitriol from both sides of the aisle. At one point, we had a very serious gun threat where someone submitted a comment saying they were going to come shoot us all. We had to go on lockdown, and it was a mess, but everyone was okay, luckily. But so I think having some security in the future would probably be good. And then the challenges of the lawsuits that are ongoing. So lessons learned. What you want is clear but flexible constitutional criteria. You want some criteria that the commission has to listen to, but maybe don't go as far as having you have to be done by this date, because maybe another pandemic happens and you gotta blow through it. We had a relatively small staff. We had an executive director, a legal counsel, and a communications director. And our budget was pretty small too. We were just working with about $3 million a year, which is a fraction of what other similarly sized commissions are. For example, Arizona has about the same population as Michigan, but they spend almost $12 million a year on their initiatives. We're doing it with only 3. But having a good professional staff to advise the commission and for the commission to direct to get work done would be very valuable in the future. Faster geographical training, faster GIS software training, things like office spaces, which were hard to come by during the pandemic. A lot of these can be traced back to the pandemic. And finally, compromise. People have to be okay with compromise. I would recommend future commissioners, if they sign up to have their name in the pool, be ready to compromise and be ready to, have your life be very public from that point forward. All right, Q&A. Thank you. I did have one question earlier about the application process. I guess that slide must have got deleted, but pretty much it was self-identifying. There was an application that you had to get notarized and submit it. Very few questions. It was like, why do you want to be on this commission? What do you hope to achieve? Stuff like that. But even someone could have filled out a blank application with just their name, as long as they were a registered voter and they didn't have family in government, they still would have been entered into the random drawing. There were about 10,000 applicants. From the 10,000 applicants, there was a first round of random drawing that went to 200. At that point, each majority minority group, the Republicans and the Democrats, were able to each strike out 10 names. That brought it to 180 applicants. And then out of those 180, there was a final drawing to get it down to the 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, and 5 independents needed. All right, I got a lot of questions. Let's start up top, I guess.
2 questions. One is, was there any attempt to diversify the committee? Number 1. And since
So the first question, there were some geographical weights put on the random drawing. I'm not sure exactly what they were. They're on the Secretary of State's website. But not racial. They were geographic. Okay. In the future, and so there's 13 of us on this commission. There are 3 minorities, myself and 2 other black women. But Michigan's a pretty diverse place. We have a very large enclave of Asian Americans, a very large enclave of Native Americans, of Indian Americans, Bengali Americans. It's really quite a diverse state. And it would be nice to see in the future to have some more, a little bit more better racial representation there. And also possibly a better representation of age groups. One of the reasons I decided to take the role of commissioner when I learned I got selected was because I saw the rest of the commission and the average age was in their 60s. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I just wanted to make sure there was a diversity of ideas and thought to have maps that were representative of everybody in our state. So that might be something to do going forward.
And the training?
We had no training before we were selected, absolutely 0. After we were selected and after we convened, we then had training from various folks. We had University of Michigan, MSU come in. We had the California Commission and Arizona Commission too, and give us some lectures. We then had more training via our professional staff that we hired, to actually do the mapping with the software and whatnot. But having more of that training, especially geographic training, would be really helpful. I mean, I definitely didn't know what all the counties were in Michigan before joining this, but I do now. I had never been to the UP prior to joining this, but I'm happy to say I have now. But training is definitely an important thing that needs to come with it.
Thanks.
Yep.
Basically, it's something that in order to get a balanced number of Republicans going
No, they were divided by category at every point. So they were already divided prior, and that they just, so they picked, I guess, for the 180, whatever that divided by the 3 groups are, and also divided by the 5 instead of the 4 for each, for the independents. So there were separate pools at each point of the process. Okay. You've had your hand up for a while in black.
What's the definition for independent in this case?
So an independent is someone who does not affiliate with either political party. We have open primaries in Michigan, so I think as long as you were not registered with either party, you could have applied as an independent. Now, I'm glad you asked that question because, you know, it's self-identifying. That might be something to look at. Do you want it to be self-identifying, or do you want there to be a little bit more constraints in the future to make sure people are who they say they are? I think everybody on our commission is who they say they were. Well, we had a lot of public outcry actually about me and another independent commissioner. You know, one day they would say I was a radical liberal, the next day they'd say I was extremely conservative. So, you know, different people will say different things, but I certainly think I'm an independent, and I think everyone who's an independent is also an independent on our commission. But, you know, different states have different ideas of what independents are as well. You know, you guys don't have open primaries here, so y'all might need to come up with, you know, maybe a third-party affiliation or something like that.
Yeah, I'm just curious, so was there any qualification or interview step or anything?
Yeah, so the question was there any sort of vetting process for commissioners? And there was not. There was absolutely no vetting process. Anyone who applied could have been selected. We had 2 folks resign after their first meeting, and then a new person was randomly drawn and ended up with the 13. But after that first meeting, after the 2 resigned, the rest of the 13 who were then chosen all are still on today. So it could create some problems. You could definitely have, I think we kind of got lucky with who was selected. We got a good group of folks selected. You know, in the future, there's a possibility that maybe a not so good group of people are selected, but overall, I think the pros of a random drawing process probably outweigh the cons.
Were all of them simultaneous, or did you start with one first?
So the question was, did we do each map separately, or did we do them concurrently? We broke it down into geographical areas. So, for example, we started in Lansing, Michigan, which was our capital. So we did Lansing for each map, and then we moved on to a different geographical area, whether that be Grand Rapids or Detroit or the UP. We did it geographically, where we would do a complete geographical area for one map, and move on to do that same geographical area for the next map, and then move on to a different geographical area. Now that kind of worked and it kind of didn't. We did a lot of going back once we thought we had completed an area and changed it. Probably the better way to do it would be to start in the most populous places, which would be, you know, in Michigan's case, the Metro Detroit area. But, you know, we didn't know that at the time.
Like this, but now I broke 5 other things.
Yeah, of course. You know, that's the so the question is, if you fix one thing, it could potentially break a different thing. And how do you fix that? That's very true. Redistricting really is like putting together a big puzzle with, you know, in our case, 110 pieces, in your case, 203 pieces, and changing any one piece changes all the other pieces. So it took a lot of work. It took a lot of late nights drawing, one commissioner after another going in a circle, trying to tackle different issues wherever they wanted to. And I mean, and keep in mind, this was a truncated process. We did all of these drawings in about 3 months due to the delay in census data. So, I mean, we were working from about 7 a.m. to 10 or 11 p.m. sometimes, just, you know, drawing all in public again. And, you know, we had some help from the public too. People in the public would submit their advice and we'd take a look at it and be like, oh, you know, this could work. And we'd go from there.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Okay. Who has the most important questions? What do you think? I see you in the back, woman in the glasses.
What exactly does it?
Yes. So the question was, what is a community of interest? The slide I had was the direct language from the Constitution. A few more, a little later. There we go. That's the definition according to the Michigan Constitution. What we do with it is up to the commission's discretion. So there were quite a few times where we had confounding or challenging communities of interest, where one group would say, this is my community of interest, another group would say, well, this is my community of interest, it's the exact opposite of what you think. And there are a few different ways to tackle that. Sometimes we would choose different communities of interest based on the type of map. For example, in Midland, which is an area like, oh, I'm doing such a Michigan thing right now. It's like right here in Michigan, okay? There were some folks that thought Midland should be put with its neighboring tri-cities, and there are some folks that thought it should be by itself. So the compromise we came up with was in the Senate map, where it's a larger district, we put them with their tri-cities, and with the House map, we put it by itself. That's one example of compromise, and our Republican commissioners were very happy about that, and definitely swayed some votes. Another compromise is to follow look at the constitutional criteria and see which lower factors reinforce the communities of interest, because they're not always mutually exclusive. Sometimes one community of interest would also help with partisan fairness, or also help with having a compact map. And if that were the case, we would often choose that community of interest that helped with the other priorities as well. And then in the yellow.
Highest priority to
Ooh.
improve that process?
That is a very good question. It wouldn't be the composition. I think the composition is quite good. I would leave it as 4, 4, and 5. I think that's a good makeup,
I think that is better than what California.
Yes, I would agree. And, Michigan's, voters not politicians, when they put up the voting initiative, they based it off of California's, but they tried to improve it. So it's probably going to take someone smarter than me to determine how it can be even further improved. But there are some things that are a little bit too specific in the Michigan Constitution, like it has very specific deadline dates. I would remove those. I would maybe make it a little bit more clear what a community of interest is or isn't. And I would make it more clear what we're to do now, because now we're trying to figure out, okay, well, we're done. Once the lawsuits are, the Constitution says we have to stay a commission until the lawsuits are over, but doesn't really say what we're to do after that. So we're trying to figure out how to disband, and then what to do if there are future lawsuits, which there almost assuredly will be, how to come back, as a commission when that happens. Or do we just stay a commission for the 10 years, which is what some other states do? But I don't think there's really an appetite for that for our commission.
And the other part of their complaint was that because it's
Yeah.
into this Constitution.
Yeah, so the question was that's kind of a question about constitutional mandates, right, in the voting process. Michigan were able to do that. There are usually 2 or 3 constitutional changes on the ballot. Just in this past election, we had a pretty good right to reproductive freedom one that definitely drove out a lot of votes. But there are definitely pros and cons. To change something once it's in the Constitution, the only way to do that is with another constitutional ballot, and that is quite hard to pull off if you're just trying to change 1 or 2 words in something. So that might be where hopefully we can share these outcomes with folks in the legislature in your state, and they can look at some of them and come up with their own compromise on language. So it doesn't necessarily need to be in the Constitution, but could be a regular law. All right, guys, thank you.